Thank you so much for inviting me to talk today, and I'm really sorry that I can't be with you in person. But I hope that by the end of this talk, you'll have been inspired to go out and look at your local sand dunes and maybe see them with different eyes. Sand dunes are distributed around the entire coast of Ireland, and as well as being very beautiful locations, they're also very diverse. They have a great range of conditions from the exposed shore to the sheltered land rear of the dunes. And this allows them to support a wide range of species, including some species that are really faithful to sand dunes and don't really occur elsewhere in Ireland, even though they're quite widespread across the dunes. There are other species that are rare outside of Ireland, but are relatively widespread here, like this petalwort, but again, it's a specialist for dune slacks in this case, in Machair. Then there are species that might have been a little bit less rare in the past, but are now limited to a few dune sites, like the northern colleats. And this was the subject of an NBDC handout recently, and I would recommend that you take a look at that. And then there are things which are at the edge of their range in Ireland, but are commoner elsewhere. So our only native toad, the natterjack, has its native range in West Kerry and nowhere else, and is dependent on dune slacks. To understand how we can preserve all of this biodiversity in sand dunes, it's really important to understand how they function. So looking at this figure, which is produced by Fiona Delany, on the left-hand side you can see there's the sea, and that washes sand up onto the shore. And once it gets there, it dries out and the wind can bring it landward. When conditions are right, the wind will deposit the sand in little pieces on every little bit of an obstacle that's on the beach. So that could be a bit of decaying seaweed maybe at the strand line. And those small deposits will build up into embryonic shifting dunes. And both the strand line and the shifting dunes are really ephemeral. They come and go. But if they can stay there long enough, marram will take hold. And marram really loves sand. It loves having sand dumped on it. And the more sand that's dumped on the marram, the faster the marram will grow. So you end up with this positive feedback. So you have fast-growing marram creating these really tall, steep dunes close to the sea. And those dunes are tall enough to shelter the land in behind them. And that's where you get what we call fixed dunes. They're much more stable than the shoreline habitats. And they tend to be quite tall near the front, and they even out and become lower and less steep as you go landwards. Where there are valleys in between the fixed dunes, sometimes they're deep enough that they're quite close to the water table, and the water might even come above the surface in winter. And we call those areas dune slacks. They're freshwater habitats. This is what that looks like in the field. Here you have embryonic dunes. There's plenty of bare sand, and in the distance there, close to the sea, you can see little small bits of strandline vegetation. Farther landwards, you have marram dunes. So these are growing on a ridge, and there's a little bit less bare sand present and a bit more vegetation cover. And finally, we have our more stable habitats. These are your fixed dunes, which are the drier areas, interspersed in this case with large dune slacks, which are full of water because this is taken in the winter. The mixture of damp and dry habitats, as well as areas that are covered with vegetation and bare sand, mean that these are really varied, especially with the north and south facing slopes. That allows them to be quite species rich. Although the amount of damp and dry areas and the height of the dunes varies quite a lot around the country, one thing that many of our sand dunes have in common is that they're rich in lime, they're in calcium carbonate, because we still have quite a lot of strong winds coming in off the Atlantic, and they supply sand quite far into the dunes, and that helps them to maintain their calcium-rich plant communities as well. And it's the combination of all of those different factors occurring close together that allows us to support so much diversity in our sand dunes. But sometimes things can get a little bit unbalanced, and one of these factors might just become too dominant. For example, here you have far too much bare areas. So this is caused by excessive destabilization. What I think probably happened here is that there were too many grazing animals in the four dunes, and there were also probably too many visitors running up and down them as well. And the vegetation became too fragmented, its roots couldn't hold anymore, and it couldn't trap the sand. So the sand just started to blow away. Now, this looks really, really bad, but there are things that you can do. I think that there's plenty of sand coming in on that beach. You can see there's loads of white, dry sand there. And it's possible that this could recover given the right treatment. At this site in the Maharees, the local community noticed that their sand was becoming very destabilised in their foredunes, and they took action. So the first thing they did was they prevented access by visitors to some of the most destabilised areas, and they also planted marram grass on points that they thought could blow out, like that track which was very exposed. But possibly most importantly, they also looked at trapping the sand. So this is boosting the natural processes that protect our dunes. On the right-hand side there, you can see that there's an old eroded scarp. And in front of that, at the front of the photograph, there's an open fence. So the aim here is that the sand will be blown up the shore by the wind, and when the wind hits that fence, it'll just slow down enough to drop the sand in behind that. And the sand will build up, and it can become vegetated through those natural means that cause embryonic dunes to develop. And here you can see it's been really successful. You've got so much sand developing and being vegetated that causes more sand to be deposited again. And now the sand is almost as high as the eroding scarp. So this has been a really successful measure at this site, and it's been adopted around the country by several different organisations. But destabilization isn't the only problem that can affect sand dunes. Overstabilization is also problematic. On this photograph, you can see that between 1995 and 2013, every time a photograph is taken, there's less bare sand in that dune. Until in 2013, there's almost none left at all. This is something that is fairly unusual in Ireland, but is common elsewhere in Europe, for example in the UK and the Netherlands, where they've taken quite serious steps to combat it. In the UK, people began to notice that as they lost bare sand in their dunes, they began to lose species as well. So there were fewer and fewer of the species that enjoy small patches of bare sand in fixed dunes, like the sand couch. And it also meant that there was less slack formation, because dune slacks are also often formed when there are blowouts in dunes. So to combat this, they've taken some what might seem extreme methods. Here, they have cut a notch out of the foredunes at Ainsdale, and the intention is that this will allow the wind to drive through that foredune and scour it even more, bringing the sand that it blows out through into the stable dunes in the back, and then you'll have a mosaic of vegetation and bare sand, which will nourish the plants because it'll also bring more limey sand back into an area that could otherwise become more acidic and less diverse. Another method that's sometimes used is to scrape off the top of the sand layer and reprofile the dunes so that they're undulating. And this can be quite good if you want to create new blowout effect for new dune slacks, because it resets everything back to a pioneer phase and you get the new pioneer dune slack species coming back into the dune. Sometimes they will even go as far as to create man-made rabbit burrows and translocate rabbits from different sites because they have so little grazing in parts of their sand dunes now in the UK. This isn't a problem that we face, but apparently it's really important to make sure that when you do this, you take a whole family, because if you only take one or two individuals from a different burrow, they'll pine. We haven't taken those steps in Ireland because we don't see that particular issue yet. However, what we do have is the ultimate man-made stabilization works. We have conifer plantations on sand dunes at some areas. When you look at the picture on the left-hand side, you can see that this conifer plantation is quite lacking in diversity compared to most herbaceous dunes. The conifers tend to shade things out, and they also lower the water table. You could think, well, there's never going to be a sand dune there again. That's gone. It's done. But on the right-hand side, you can see that somebody has taken out, at that same site, a large patch of conifers. This was outside the SAC, and they removed both the stumps and the trunks. And they've left this beautiful white sand behind. And that could be restored back to either an early pioneer stage of dune, or with some extra work, you could restore the fixed dune community there. In this case, they've put piles of topsoil on it because that's being prepared for a football pitch. But we have selected 4 sites around Ireland where we're going to do some small-scale experiments with removing conifer plantations and restoring the fixed dunes. The reason we're doing it at small areas is because you have to be really careful. Even this type of conifer plantation on sand dunes can support rare species like wintergreen, for example. So once you've got rid of some of those really, really challenging issues like destabilization or overstabilization, you can find ways of targeting particular species that like very, very particular conditions. So you're looking at making things just right. And the best tool that we have found in Ireland for doing this is a very traditional one. By using extensive cattle grazing, we can tweak the vegetation height and structure to suit different species. So for example, if you were looking at supporting petalwort, you might have a tightly grazed sward and have a slightly higher number of cattle. But if you wanted to support, for example, dunlin or other breeding birds that are ground nesting, you might take off some of those cattle and just let the sward grow a little bit taller. So I'm coming towards the end of the talk now, but the message that I wanted to send you home with today was that even though sand dunes are in some ways quite fragile, they're also immensely dynamic. And when they look like they're in terrible condition, as long as there's sand coming into the system, there's often huge potential for them to recover. But they are semi-natural habitats, so to avoid them from scrubbing over and becoming less diverse, we do need ongoing management, and we still have the tools in Ireland to do that through cultural activities like extensive grazing. But there's no one type of dune that we need to aim for. To maintain the wide variety of species that sand dunes can support, we need to ensure that we maintain a variety of different conditions so that we have the Goldilocks conditions for each species that we want to preserve. And on that note, I'm going to let you go. Thank you so much for listening to this talk today, and if you'd like to visit any of the sites that were featured here, they're listed below.